Hello, I'm Chris Merritt, and with me is George Williams from the University of New South Wales and my colleague Sally Layson. We're from the Rule of Law Institute of Australia, and we're here to discuss the impact of the pandemic, not on health, but on lawmaking and liberty. Before the pandemic, nobody could have imagined the way that the community has been asked to comply with health orders that have required immense sacrifices from individuals and from businesses. And while there's been overwhelming compliance with those orders, we've also witnessed a level of civil disobedience in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. We're also seeing new institutional frameworks, not just national cabinet that everybody knows about, but powerful health officials whose assessments have been of vital importance on what we can do and what we can't do, even whether we can leave our homes. While the growing level of vaccinations will ease the pressure for restrictions, COVID-19 is showing no signs of disappearing. So it looks like society is adjusting to a new era of rulemaking. The big issue is whether the new institutional frameworks are fit for purpose and whether we are bringing democratic norms with us as we enter this new era. George, one of the things that's jumped out has been the failure of the New South Wales Upper House to sit. Is this worrying you during a time when people are being confined to their homes and their activities are being restricted?
It does worry me, Chris, and it worries me because, of course, we're seeing at the moment the state government exercising some of the most extraordinary powers in its history. And it may be that's justified, but that's something that does need to be tested. In fact, the more extraordinary the power, the more vigilant the community needs to be, the more scrutiny there needs to be, the more opportunities for transparency. So at a time like this, just as it is during times of war and other crises, it's actually more important that our elected representatives can meet, can ask questions. That needs to be visible to the community to provide confidence, and those parliamentarians need to use their powers where required to access documents and to make sure that government is making good decisions and acting in the community interest.
What's the consequence if that doesn't happen?
Well, we are left bereft of arguably the most important accountability mechanism for any government, and that is Parliament. Things like question time, things like the ability to hold proper inquiries that can demand. I can understand why government is awfully busy at the moment, but it's just not acceptable to remove those forms of scrutiny and accountability. And I think we're poorer for that. We're poorer because governments, of course, when they're subject to that scrutiny, are always wondering, have we got it right? You know, we are going to be subject to the test. We are going to be questioned. Perhaps it's easier to put mistakes to one side that perhaps should have led to questions and changed approaches. And also, even though there may be inquiries and other things afterwards, there's nothing quite like contemporaneous scrutiny and accountability. And I think the community's the loser, but also our response is the loser, because I think without that form of accountability, the danger is we won't get it right.
As I understand it, the rule that's preventing the New South Wales Upper House from sitting is that the government needs to provide a minister to be in the Upper House. Is that does that need to be reassessed in the light of what we've seen?
I think it does, and I think perhaps with hindsight, people didn't realise how it could be misused and manipulated. Frankly, we just didn't see a possibility Parliament wouldn't sit. I mean, that's just what Parliament does. It takes something like a pandemic to lead us to re-question whether, in fact, that's always going to happen. So I think it actually would be wise to change that. I don't think we want governments being able to manipulate sittings by simply not providing a minister. And it should be clear that Parliament can sit even if a minister decides to boycott and try and frustrate the activities of the body.
So I don't think everyday Australians haven't realised that the MPs haven't been sitting, even though there are an essential service like a nurse. They have not actually met since June, even though they've given more health orders in the last 2 months. They've had less sittings. So they obviously need the sittings to trigger some accountability options.
Well, they do. And of course, at this time when we're confined to homes and many people have lost jobs, the last thing on their mind is, has Parliament sat today? So you can understand why it's not front of mind for many people. And in fact, you depend upon Parliament and the energy, the excitement that can bring to actually attract media attention and to educate people about what's going on. So it's pretty easy sometimes for Parliament just to wait in a case like this. And it's why we need mechanisms and structures that actually demand the sitting, not just leaving it in a discretion, but to say, even if we're in a pandemic, well, at the very least adapt. You know, everyone else can use Zoom and other technologies, get with the times, as the Commonwealth has. I really can't see any excuse for Parliament not sitting, given how adaptable other organisations have proved to be.
Do you think that would ease any community concern about restrictions on liberty, people being restricted to their homes, not being able to work? Do you think if people could see the fact that their elected representatives have at least considered these orders, there'd be less likely to be civil disobedience in the streets?
I do, and in fact, that's a mark of a civilised society, that where there's disagreement, you can have it debated in Parliament, you can bring an action in court. We have ways of raising issues that don't require people going to the streets, and perhaps it's not surprising people have gone to the streets when the normal mechanisms aren't available and when the courts, frankly, have little to do often in a case like this. So I think if we'd seen more of it, then people might have had an outlet for those concerns that has been lacking.
In Victoria, you are fundamentally responsible. You're the man responsible for the Victorian Charter of Rights. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Are you happy with the way it's working? And is there anything that you'd like to change about it or apply in a different way? Are there new provisions that you'd like to see?
I mean, where it is working is there are many examples of where the Victorian government has said they've considered the Charter. They've looked for proportionate outcomes. There's been some court cases as well down there that have also considered those matters. But I think it's fair to say that the Charter, at a time like this, probably lacks some of the teeth that could actually take it further. It is essentially an instrument of its time that's about influencing what Parliament and government does. It's not about having the last say. And indeed, I'm not even suggesting it could go that far, but I think you could argue that when you're dealing with a crisis of this kind, it'd be better to have something that's a mere influence, more than a mere influence, that can actually be a bit more effective in some areas, a bit more decisive. A good example is with curfews. I mean, I'd like to see the Charter there, where it's actually not clear we have a remaining clear health justification that's sufficiently strong to justify curfews. That's where you would like a charter, a Bill of Rights or something, having a bigger impact, I think. The same at the federal level, if we had an instrument there with things like preventing Australians exiting the country. And it's not clear to me either that could be really justified, and that's a weakness in our system, that we don't have stronger checks and balances, I think, to call those sort of decisions to account.
That implies a need for greater transparency about the factual basis for these orders. Are you happy with the amount of information that's currently being made available to the community?
No, I think our governments should be going further. I think they should be more readily releasing things like the modelling upon which decisions are made, not just at convenient times, but earlier. And that's, of course, where you'd expect parliamentary committees to be doing that. I mean, that's the normal way. Parliament would be called to account in question time or a parliamentary committee. They might be asked, in fact, compelled even to produce modelling and other documents. Health officials can be subject to questioning. There's been a bit of that, but not much. But I think that's been a weakness, because it's really been a trust us approach. And to some extent, we must trust them. But I think we're also entitled to more information to understand why decisions have been made, and really, are they proportionate? And in fact, in some cases, have the decisions gone too far?
I was going to say that they also rely on Parliament sitting. So will the Charter, if New South Wales had a Charter of Rights and the legislation's passed as what is delegated legislation, does that mean they would get to bypass the Charter of Rights because they're not sitting, so they don't have to deliberate over those things?
It's always true, I think, that if Parliament is sitting and there's a robust opposition with a good committee structure, that matters a lot. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that if you just had a charter, that the courts by themselves are likely to be effective. I mean, very often it's the political accountability mechanisms that are more effective at a time like this. But I mean, a well-constructed charter could still enable a court to require the production of evidence, make sure that's assessed, determine if there's a rational basis for a decision. I mean, that would be slow, is part of the problems with courts at a time like this, but it would be better than what we've got at the moment.
Mm. What about the political process? Have you been surprised that this absence of information hasn't taken on a greater traction with the community? I've been startled by the level of acceptance, if you like, of draconian orders that are obviously necessary for health reasons, but the basis for them is effectively being kept secret, if you like, from the community. Would you like to see that changed?
I'd like to see more information, yes. I must admit I'm not overly surprised either. I mean, if we look at, for example, what happened at other moments of national crisis, World War I, World War II are examples. You saw there the community move from, I think, a more questioning attitude to simply, we're going to trust you. We need you to make decisions in our interest. We probably don't have the energy, in fact, to even be as politically engaged and active as we might. And I think fear often dampens the desire of people to know more. They just really want, in many cases, government to do what's required. That's not really a healthy thing. It actually undermines vigilance. But at these times of national crisis, in the end, the community does invest enormous power and trust in politicians. But that's also where you need your structures, you need your institutions that can step up at a time like that to make sure that that trust is well placed.
What about national cabinet? Are you happy with the way that institution has emerged? And
I think it was a good idea to create the national cabinet. We do need the regular meetings, the coordination. I'm not sure cabinet, of course, is the right word. It's not a cabinet after all, but fair enough if that's what they want to label it. I don't think it should be subject to the secrecy, though, of a cabinet. I'm glad to see that we've had an action which has actually exposed that transparency. I think also we do need to recognise that, of course, it hasn't always produced the consensus across the country. We have seen fractures, some very large differences, but that was always likely to happen. I mean, if nothing else, the different political persuasions, the tension between Commonwealth and state, I think the National Cabinet has worked tolerably well in the circumstances. Tolerably well, probably exceed some of my expectations anyway, given how dysfunctional many of these relationships and structures were before the pandemic.
Democracy has always been a little bit messy. Do you think that's just a function of the messy federation?
Well, it is. And of course, if we just had a dictatorship, it wouldn't be so messy. And you'd have health orders imposed, you'd have directives. But when we do have a democracy and we have during the course of the pandemic a number of elections scheduled as well, that has a big distorting impact. If nothing else, you will always see state premiers arguing for parochial state-based solutions, which, as we've seen, are electorally very popular. That may not be in the national interest, but it may well be in their interest, indeed the interest of their state. What's been surprising to me is we haven't seen a bit more assertion of the national interest from the Prime Minister and the government. I mean, John Howard was never shy in doing this, nor have other leaders. And at some point, you'd expect on things like borders and the like that we will actually see a reassertion of the Australian interest as opposed to the Queensland or Western Australian. But that may need to wait until after the next federal election.
So do you think the new power balance, if you like, in the Federation, do you think that's likely to stay, that the states are likely to retain this elevated position that they've got?
For a time, yes. And of course, it may be that the pandemic and its aftermath lingers for a long time. It may be we see the re-emergence of health scares and concerns that will again elevate the importance of the states which control the logistics, the health system, the police, all of the agencies that essentially are frontline and critical for keeping the community safe. So you'd expect that this will last for some time, but I certainly wouldn't see it as a permanent shift. If nothing else, the Commonwealth holds all the cards. It's the one that controls the revenue in this nation. It's the one that controls the powers. It's the one that appoints the High Court judges. So the deck is really stacked to the Commonwealth. I see this as a temporary aberration in what has been a very long process of the Commonwealth becoming more and more powerful. It is an aberration, but we'll just have to see how long it lasts for.
So overall, you would agree, I presume, that the health orders are lawful, that they've been lawfully made, but it's really a question of community confidence and appearance that seems to be problematic. Would that be an accurate way of summing up your position?
And I think on that bare question of legality, yes, it's extremely likely they're lawfully made. There are very few gaps or problems. There was, for example, a challenge to the India travel ban that failed. There's little or nothing in our constitution that might have much purchase on this. You may have a Section 92 freedom of interstate trade angle at some point for the border closures, but by and large, I mean, the powers are well constructed. They give extraordinary discretions to ministers, and they have been operating within the terms of those discretions. You only have to look at, say, the New South Wales discretions, which enable the state health minister to indicate there's a problem of a health concern of some kind, and that simply means they can make almost whatever health orders they want. So it's set up to make the most extraordinary and far-reaching declarations. So not surprisingly, the declarations made fit within the terms of those powers.
It just makes me wonder, have we given emergency powers too broad? I mean, are we allowing under the guise of emergency too much to be made?
I think we are, yes. And I think too much to be done without proper scrutiny. And if you take, for example, the federal power under the Biosecurity Act, there the federal health minister, once you have one of these emergencies, can make any direction, any declaration that he thinks is necessary to meet the threat of the pandemic. Not only that, his declarations are expressed to override any other law, including laws made by Parliament, and Parliament is prevented from disallowing any of his declarations. I mean, that's as close to a dictatorship as you can get. And frankly, there's just no good reason for that. Why shouldn't Parliament disallow things if it turns out they're being poorly made? And I think that's where, in fact, it's gone overboard. And in the absence of better human rights and other checks, we better hope they make good decisions, because really there's not many comebacks for the community. And that's worrying, because maybe the trust is well placed, but that is a risky thing to do. There are many countries which show the lack of wisdom, I think, investing such extraordinary powers without better checks.
Absolutely.
Okay, right. That's a good note, or a depressing note, actually, to finish on. We've been talking to George Williams from the University of New South Wales.